Okay,
Hey,
hi. Yeah. Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ishan Singhal. I'm not sure if I pronounced correctly. Yes, okay. So Ishan is currently doing a postdoc at Sussex Centre for Consciousness Science at the University of Sussex, where he moved in November last year. He did his PhD at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur. And during his PhD, he looked at to formalizing temporal properties of consciousness. And in 2022, he won the William James Prize from the ASC for his work, and specifically for a contribution that synthesized models of temporal phenomenology with empirical research in consciousness science. And currently, he's working in NLSET's lab, involving bringing insights from indeterminacy and temporal phenomenology to predictive processing theories. And today he is going to talk to us about time as a fundamental aspect of consciousness. So take it away, Ishan.
thank you, Nadine, for that introduction and the invitation to come and present. Um, it's um, it's something that I've been part of as a participant, so it's really nice to be invited. Right, I'll get right on with it then. So thank you everyone for joining. And today I'm going to be talking about time as a fundamental aspect of consciousness. So what I'll be doing over this talk is initially I'll be setting the stage for studying time through philosophy, phenomenology, and trying to show you the different ways in which people have tried to study time, whether it's through duration perception, timing of experience contents, or the phenomenological regularities over which our experience unfolds. And I'll be putting these together in a framework to conceptualize some temporal properties that pervade our experiences. Then I'll be going over some of the empirical data where we have looked to elucidate these properties of our experience. And then I'll be showing you how we can use these to understand some more private or subjective experiences like imagination. And finally, in a more ambitious avenue for this research, I'll talk a little bit about how we can use this to conceptualize sensory perceptual experiences in non-human minds. So to do all of this, let's first look at why we should study time as a feature of consciousness. And one thing that I keep reminding people of when it comes to time, that time seems to be the only psychological or experiential property that's present in both the structure and content of experience. So what this means is not only do we experience time, but the mechanisms that underlie our experiences are also dynamic. So both of them, like both our experiences and the mechanisms which underlie our experiences unfold in time. Note that this is not true for any other psychological property. For instance, for me to have an experience of the color white as I'm looking at my screen right now, nothing in my brain has to itself be white. But when it comes to time, like as I'm as you're following the sounds or the speech that I'm making right now, not only are you experiencing the flow of words as they go from one to the other, but the representations that you have for that auditory structure also follows the same dynamics that you experience. Secondly, time seems to be an inescapable property of experience. No matter what modality of experience, what state of experience, what content of experience, all of them seem to have temporal properties. That means they have an order, they change, they have a duration, they have an extent, or persistence. So the approach that I've been taking in studying time is summarized very nicely by a quote from Ian Phillips, and I'll just read this out quickly. So he says the way we go about trying to answer the question concerning the temporal structure of a conscious experience is by making a judgment about the temporal structure of the apparent objects of consciousness, and then by taking our experience to be structured in the same way. All this means is the way experience unfolds in time as it is presented to us is the way that it is represented by its underlying mechanisms. So he argues that we can understand um, the underlying mechanisms of consciousness or their dynamics by understanding the dynamics of experience itself. Moving forward, it's also sometimes important to list down the temporal properties of an experience, because generally people think that when you talk about time of experience, all you're interested in is duration, like how long you experience something. But that's not all there is to time. So your experience marks contents in a specific order. You anticipate ongoing experiences. Your experience flows in a particular direction. And your experience seems to be nested over different time scales. What this means is that different aspects of your experience evolve over different time scales. And I'll be talking about some of these in today's talk. Right, so when it comes to conceptualizing how our experience unfolds in time, there have been certain models in temporal phenomenology, and they can be broadly split into these three families, though each of them have their own particular submodels, but I'll just introduce you to them broadly. So you can conceptualize your experience as evolving in frames. So you could say that uh, that your experience is not inherently dynamic, but it's just a series of snapshots. And when these snapshots are played really quickly, it seems like there is a continuous flow to your experience. Whereas the other way to conceptualize it is to argue that both the contents and the representations of experience are extended in time. So both of them persist over the same durations, which is what people in philosophy sometimes call the extensional models of time consciousness. And finally, you have a third school of models called the retentional protensional models. So they argue that your experience is still point-like, or the representations of your experience are still point-like, but they have a timeline associated with them, which is both carrying like perceptual echoes of things that have just passed and anticipating things that are about to occur. And depending on how you trace the history of these models, you can go back maybe 1,000 years to Augustine or 2,000 years to Buddhism, where similar conceptualizations have been made in trying to pin down how exactly is it that our experience unfolds. And usually these have been done exclusively. So people argue that it's either one way or the other. Similarly, when it comes to studying time perception, people have shown that the experience of time distorts in different ways. So for instance, you can have a distortion of change and order. So on the screen right now, I have what is called the flash lag illusion. So what happens here is this red square moves across the screen and a green square is flashed underneath it. Even though, I mean, the illusion here is that even though the green square flashes exactly in line with the red square, you see the red square as um, being ahead of the green square. So the green square feels as though it lags behind the moving red square. So this is one kind of temporal illusion, a distortion that occurs in our experience. Similarly, you can have distortions of, sorry, my screen is frozen. Moving forward. Sorry, let me just stop sharing and try to share it again. Sorry about that. Sorry, my screen seems to have been, all right. So the other kind of temporal distortion is which comes from oddball events. So here after a series of repeated stimuli which are the same, if a novel stimulus is presented, you think that the novel stimulus came for a longer time, even though it was presented for the same time. And finally, you can have distortions of your experience based on emotional contents like frightening events. So this is a really cool study by David Eagleman. So what he did here was he made people wear a watch that had a flickering display that was masking a digit. So the display flickered at a rate just above people's flicker threshold, so they couldn't see um, the digit that was being masked by the flicker. And then what he did was he took people to an amusement park in Texas, and he threw them from a height of 160 feet onto a safety net. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to see whether when people say that fear slows down time, does it slow down time at such an extent that the flickering display on people's watches would like people's perception of the flicker would slow down such that they could see the number being masked. And what he found was that people couldn't actually see the number being masked. So even though people said that time did slow down and they overestimated the duration of their fall, uh, the nature of the temporal distortion wasn't such that people actually saw things more clearly in time. So what I'm trying to bring out here is that you can have unique distortions of time in your experience, which can either alter things that you represent at a very short time scale or how you remember things. And these distortions need not be across the scale. So like when we say that fear dilates time or slows time down, that doesn't mean you literally see things as having been slowed down. Finally, a third place where people have been studying time is in the timing of experiences. So how long does it take for um, the brain to represent novel stimuli? How quickly do bistable stimuli switch in your experience? And what are the regularities with which these things occur? Like how fast can your perceptual system pay attention to a novel stimulus and so on? And what people have done is they've identified regularities uh, in neurophysiological activities as they unfold over time. So this work usually comes from things like the rhythms of attention or the rate at which perceptual stimuli are bound in moments and windows of integration and so on. So the idea here is that people have, like I've been trying to show you that there are three seemingly disparate avenues of inquiry into time, which is the phenomenology of it, the psychology of it in terms of distortions of perceived time, and the neurophysiology of it, which is the timing of these processes. And the idea is that all of them seem to be having these unique regularities. And how can we bring them together, right? Like how can we abstract something universal from them? And in one of the things that we did a few years ago was to try and create a framework where we could bring them together. So we created a hierarchical framework where we assigned different time scales to these phenomenological modes that I was talking about. So the cinematic, extensional, and retentional modes. And what we did was we placed more than 35 empirical findings from consciousness science within this hierarchy based on whether they altered temporal experience and the nature of that alteration, whether it was like misaligning a frame in your experience, whether it was based on an extended context, or whether it was based on uh, sort of these conceptual memory representations of what had just occurred. And we could show that not only do they align in the time scales at which they occurred, but also in the phenomenological nature. And then we propose a sort of toy model of multiplexing between oscillations at different frequency to show how these interactions could possibly occur through frequency and amplitude modulation or phase locking and things like that. And I mean, I don't have time to go into all of these, but there were experiments from change blindness, attentional blink, chronostasis, continuous flash suppression, and so on. And I'll just very quickly give you an example from a paradigm that's familiar to quite a few of us, that is from attentional blink. So what we did here was we classified two kinds of attentional blink. So at the top, you have the standard paradigm where people have to pick out pre-queued targets from a series of letters. So here it would be numbers amongst a series of letters which were distractors. And the usual finding is that if the second number comes within a certain lag period of the first target, people can't report it. And what we argued was that this is a case of people being able to see but not consolidate this new percept in their retention of that moment. Versus you can have attentional blink in another way where you can present people parts of a figure in a similar RSVP. So here, the blink is that people can't tell. So here, what you look out for is that when these parts are presented really quickly, people tend to integrate them and see them as a whole square. And the blink here is that even though people see everything, they can't tell you the order of the pieces that they integrated. So let's say you presented them these two frames, and this is like people saw the whole square. They wouldn't be able to tell you whether the target with the diagonals this way came before the targets with the diagonal this way. So the blink here is where people can't separate these frames in their experience anymore. Now, if you want to see more about the different findings that we placed into this framework, you can go and have a look at this paper that we put out a few years ago now. But the question is, what exactly can we say about the organization of consciousness through such a framework? And I'll be talking about two things that we did as follow-ups to this through empirical studies. And the first one is trying to link time, like the experience time of experience, with how our experience evolves in time. So when it comes to understanding how we perceive time, you can sort of break down how time is represented into these two different representational systems. So one which I'm calling temporal tagging, and the other that I call temporal mirroring. So the idea here is that you can, like, the brain can represent time through tags, like similar to how Amazon represents where your package is. So each time you can have a timestamp that at this time the package was shipped, at this time it reached the dispatch center, and then so on. So the way to represent time there would be to subtract the two time tags and then see how much duration has passed. So in the brain, it would be something like marking the onset of a stimulus and then marking the offset of the stimulus and then subtracting them and coming up with an estimate for how long the stimulus was on the screen. Whereas in a temporal mirroring representational scheme, you would have something like, instead of representing time explicitly, you would represent it implicitly. So the representation of time would be how long the stimulus persisted itself. So you would not have a marker, but the inherent perceptual activity of the stimulus persisting over time would be what you experience. So to show that there is a temporal mirroring between our experience and the contents of our experience, what we did was we needed a way to show that perceived time is a function of perceived content. So what we did was we took a bistable image, which was a Necker cube. And generally, when people see the Necker cube, their perception of it flips continuously as they view it over time. So people can go to seeing it from above, and then suddenly there's a switch, and you start seeing it in the other perspective. And the thing is that in our experience, this switch seems instantaneous. It's almost like a step function. But if you look at the underlying neurophysiology of it, there's a brief time gap before the switch can occur, right? So there's a brief period of time where our perceptual system is still resolving the other interpretation of this figure, and it's not actually instantaneous.
Sorry, Ishan, just a clarification
Yeah.
question. What kind of measure is that?
Yeah, so right. So people use this is from previous studies where they looked at theta gamma coupling. So what they show is that theta gamma, like if you're recording EEG, you get frontoparietal theta gamma coupling just before a perceptual switch. And they argue that that there is this brief period that the time that it takes to undergo the switch is sort of absent from your experience, right? So what we did was we wanted to see that when this perceptual switch occurs, and if there is a period of time that is absent from your experience, would people say that the whole duration was sort of contracted? Like if this period of the time where the perceptual system is still resolving the alternate interpretation of the Necker cube is deleted from your experience, then people would judge this whole duration as being shorter than it was when there's a perceptual switch. So what we did for that was we had a Necker cube. We asked people to view it in a certain way. And then, oops, sorry, this is stuck again. Sorry, I'll just reshare the screen. I don't know why this keeps happening.
No worries. We should check how this influences our time perception of your talk.
Right, okay, I'll just skip over the video. So what we did was we presented the Necker cube and we asked people to view it in a certain way, which is indicated by these ABCD letters here. So they should see this side as facing forward. And then when participants told us that they're seeing it in that way, what we did was we used an external object that passed through this cube. And this object passed through the cube, either maintaining the geometry of how they were seeing it or violating the geometry of how they were seeing it. So if it violated the geometry, it automatically led to a switch. And then what we did was we asked people to estimate the time that this object took to go across the screen. And what we found was whenever there was a perceptual switch, people would give lower estimates of how long had passed. And we did this in a bunch of ways using controls for attention. We even had a free viewing paradigm where we removed the object and let the cube switch naturally and so on. And we consistently found that trials in which a switch occurred were reported as lasting for a shorter period of time than trials in which a switch didn't occur. Now, the question that came to us when we got these results was, is this something to do with memory or is this something to do with experience, right? Because there is an event boundary when the cube switches, maybe people are misplacing how long has passed because there's some attention that goes in updating, okay, the cube has switched, and maybe the time loss is a confound from event boundaries. So what we did was we designed a phenomenological demonstration to show that it's based on experience. So what we did was we took a Necker cube and put these series of repeating numbers inside it. So it's just an RSVP that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 each time, right? And what we did was we asked people to notice that when the cube switches, do they miss out a number from the RSVP? So what we found is that participants usually said that when the cube switched, the RSVP looked to them like going as 1, 2, 4. So it's as if the number 3 just dropped out from their experience. So what we like through this demo and through these results, we argued that when the cube switches, your visual awareness of the cube pauses for a brief period, and that pause is deleted from your experience when you're trying to estimate the time for it. Right. And I mean, if you want to see the control studies and more the fine grain results, you can check out the paper that came out a couple of years ago. The second thing that I want to talk to you about is where we tested the idea that our experience evolves over multiple time scales. So as you remember that in the framework that I was talking about, we argued that different phenomenological aspects of your experience evolve over different time scales. And this is something that's been really hard to bring into consciousness science because like even though there are experiments from neuroscience or phenomenology or these meta studies that look at different temporal regularities of different psychological processes, when it comes to consciousness theories, we're just still stuck at whether consciousness happens early or late. And we're always almost implying this camera metaphor that a stimulus came on, there was some processing, and boom, there was a percept. And the only thing that we're interested in is what was this delay from the onset of a stimulus to the onset of experience. And people keep theorizing consciousness as having just this single time scale, right? So the question that we were faced with is how do we convince people that different aspects actually evolve in parallel over different time scales? So like what is the way out from this? So we thought that maybe the way we can do this is by the logic of perturbation. So you might be familiar of this from like introductory textbooks of cognitive neuroscience. So how do we establish double dissociation in functional specialization of brain regions? You do it by showing that damage to one brain region impairs language production, but not comprehension, while damage to another brain region impairs language comprehension, but not language production. Right, so the idea was, can you do these kind of perturbations for different time scales of your experience? So can you selectively impair different regularities over which your experience is evolving? And we thought we'll do this in a paradigm which is familiar to consciousness research instead of developing something new. So what we did was we picked the continuous flash suppression paradigm. So what happens here is this is a binocular rivalry setup. So what you do is you present a pattern noise mask to one eye and a target image to the other eye. And what like people's experience of this setup is initially they only see the pattern mask, and then slowly over time, the target emerges from behind this pattern mask. And the history of this paradigm has been such that people use only a single flicker rate. So this pattern mask usually flickers at around 10 hertz, which comes from a relic of consciousness studies, which used to argue that your experience updates every 100 milliseconds. So what we did here was we took the same paradigm, but we played around with 4 different flicker rates. So we used 10 hertz, which is the standard flicker rate that people use. And we used 1 hertz, 4 hertz, and 25 hertz as values from the hierarchical framework that I was telling you about. And we wanted to see whether these 4 flicker frequencies selectively impair different kinds of processes that underlie visual awareness. And the four different aspects of experience that we used were, one was a simple breakthrough task. So how quickly do contents enter your awareness? The other was a spatial localization task, which is where people had to find this oval target. So their task was to locate the quadrant in which this target is present. Uh, the third was about perceptual binding, like using illusory contours. So there's a history in this paradigm which shows that uh, targets with illusory contours break out from this pattern mask suppression quicker than if you arranged these sort of Pac-Man figures randomly. And finally, we wanted to see the regularity with which contents exit our awareness. So like how does our experience devolve from a moment to moment perspective? So here we presented people with the target first and then brought in the suppression to see how quickly um, the suppression takes over the target. So this was sort of a reverse CFS paradigm. And what we found was that all of these different experiments or all of these different psychological tasks were impaired at different flicker frequencies. So when it came to contents breaking into your awareness, they took the longest when the mask flickered at 4 hertz. When people were doing an attentional sampling task, they were slowest to do it when the flicker frequency of the mask was 10 hertz. Similarly, this benefit of illusory contours breaking into your experience faster than random organizations of this Kanisa figure disappeared at 25 hertz. So the benefit of illusory contours was no longer there when the mask flickered at 25 hertz, which is when the mask impaired something like early perceptual binding, which is thought to occur in that frequency range. And finally, when we had people seeing the target first and then the flicker being brought in, it took longest at 1 hertz for the flicker to mask the target completely. So with this, what we tried to show is that different flicker frequencies selectively impair different aspects of your experience, which were tied down to the regularities at which they occur. Right, so we interpreted them as this idea that at any moment of your experience, you're sampling at one particular frequency, you're updating contents at one frequency, you're binding them together and retaining them over time at another frequency. And thankfully, this paper just came out last week. So if you're interested in knowing more about this, you can have a look at that. Right. Now, for the next half of my talk, I'm going to show you how we can use these temporal regularities to study instances of imagination, or where we can, how do we use these temporal regularities to establish equivalences of experience between people? Right. So if I say that I imagine a red apple, and you say you imagine a red apple, how do we go to establish that we do it in somewhat similar ways? So when it comes to previous studies on imagination, people have tried to do this through interviews or questionnaires or think out aloud responses, and they've tried to see whether people can imagine things equally when it comes to vividness or clarity and so on. People have also looked at the neuroscience of it, like how early can you decode imagined contents, which regions can you decode imagined contents for, and whether that is similar between people. There are also really cool studies from the 1980s, especially from Ronald Fink's lab, that looked at like they used to train participants in being able to draw what they're imagining or to project what they're imagining onto a wall to see how big the visual field of imagination was, and so on. But the problems with these studies was, I mean, in most cases, they were indirect measures, or they required extensive training, or they had issues of language and labels. So we wanted to use a temporal, we wanted to see whether we can capture the dynamics of experience in a way where we could sort of subvert these issues. But before I go to the study, there's something that I need you to understand. So when it comes to perception, people are like, there are models which try to show how different regularities in our perception are related to each other. So this is a very simple relationship that exists in visual perception. So let's say if I show you an echo cube and I note down the time that it takes for the echo cube to switch in your experience, that seems to scale with your temporal resolution. So let's say if I flash two dots on a screen really quickly and ask you to tell me which dot came first. So that's your temporal resolution. And how long it takes for an echo cube to switch is the stability of your percept. And what people have found is that both of these scale together to optimize windows of your experience. So let's say that it takes 4 or 5 seconds for an echo cube to switch in your experience. And the temporal resolution of vision is about 30 milliseconds. So if you have a finer resolution, like a finer temporal resolution in your vision, you'll have longer delays in echo cube switching. Okay, so these are ways in which people have tried to relate different temporal aspects of experience. And we wanted to see whether we can find a similar relationship when it comes to imagination. So we wanted people, like the paradigm that we use for people to tell us the stability and the resolution of their experience comes from a match to sample paradigm. So people used to use this in psychophysics in the early 20th century when they wanted to see how people see colors. So the way this paradigm used to work was people were shown a test patch and a sample patch, and they had like knobs of RGB, so they could change the red, green, and blue composition of a color patch such that it matches a sample patch. So people use these recreations to try and guess how people are seeing the color orange, for instance. So we used the same match to sample paradigm when it came to different aspects of people's imagination. So what we did was we tried to measure how quickly people could flicker something in their imagination, how quickly they could rotate something, how smoothly they imagined some action movements like dance and exercises, and how long they could maintain contents of their imagination. And what we did for this was we asked people to sort of recreate these aspects using an interface in their browser. So for instance, to measure the flicker rate of imagination, we literally presented people with a flickering square on the screen. And we told them, close your eyes, try to make this square flicker as fast as possible. And then once you're ready, use this slider to change the flicker rate of this actual square on the screen to match how fast you can flicker it in your imagination. And we did the same thing for like rotation speed and so on. I'll show you some examples of how we did this for smoothness and extent. So, I mean, the study was done in India, so we used clips of dances and yoga exercises because that's something people are quite familiar with. and we wanted to use an action sequence that wasn't too hard for them to imagine. So what we did was we played people a dance clip, let's say, and it was a 10-second dance clip with a clear start and finish. And we asked people to familiarize themselves with this dance sequence for as long as they wanted. And then we asked them to tell us how smoothly they imagined this dance sequence unfolding in their imagination by changing smoothness on a slider. And what the slider did was it changed the percentage of frames that were dropped from this clip. So it could look something like this, where not many frames are dropped, or it could look something like this, where a lot of the frames of the video are dropped, where the sequence feels sort of skippy and jumpy between movements. And we did this for a range of different smoothness levels. Then we also measured persistence, which is how long people could sustain a continuously repeating sequence. So for this, what we did was we recorded a clip of road stripes in front of our university. So this is me and my wife on a moped just filming the road stripes in front of our university. And what we did here was we asked people to imagine these road stripes continuously flowing in their experience. And we asked them to insert a break in this clip whenever they felt that the imagination of these road stripes sort of fell through or broke out. So what this experiment looked like, where people had this GIF playing continuously, and they could insert this jitter or this blank screen to mark how long they could continuously imagine this before it fell out, and they had to put effort to reimagine it. So they could indicate, for instance, that it broke out pretty quickly, or they could indicate that it stayed on for a while and then it broke out. And we got a lot of data on these tasks. So around 800 people did at least one task, and somewhere around 700 people did all of these tasks. And first of all, what we found was, as you'd expect, that imagination was quite sluggish when compared to perception. So the flicker rate of perception is in the order of 30 milliseconds. But people, when it came to imagination, on average reported flickering squares in their imagery at around 300 milliseconds. Similarly, when it came to smoothness, people reported a frame rate of about 150 milliseconds, versus when it comes to like visual perception, people experience smoothness at around 60 or 70 milliseconds delays between frames. However, people had a much higher stability when it came to imagined content. So if you take the Necker cube as a conceptual equivalent of stability of a percept, it's usually around 3 to 4 seconds. But when it came to imagination, people could hold on to contents of their imagination for 4.5 or 5 seconds. Though, then what we did was we fed these data into exploratory factor analysis to try and see what dimensions we could use to capture the variability of people's performance in these tasks. And what we found was the same relationship that holds for visual perception, that is a trade-off between temporal ability and stability, which is like resolution and maintenance, held also for imagination. So the same sort of temporal organization that exists for organizing windows of experience between resolution and stability, the same principle also applied to imagination. This work is still currently under revision, like it's on, so I don't have a paper to point you to it for more details, but I'm happy to chat about this later, and hopefully it'll be out soon. Okay, so for the, yeah, I'm just going to skip this because I already mentioned it. Yep. So for the last 15 minutes of my talk, I'm going to talk about something more crazy and more ambitious. So this is something that I tried to do last year as a postdoctoral grant and it got rejected. So if it seems a bit shit, it probably was. But the idea here is that now, if there is a temporal regularity to experience, can we take this one step further to speculate about regularities in experience of non-human minds? Right? And I'll try to walk you through this. So one of the problems that exists in trying to relate experiences between species is the fact that nature partitions access to reality across species. So when it comes to, let's say, vision or audition, different species are sensitive to different wavelengths or different frequency bands, right? Moreover, we're like sometimes the umwelts between species are so different that there is no correspondence, right? So we use different navigation strategies. We have different number of photoreceptors. We can sense different kinds of stimuli. So some species can sense magnetic fields while the others can't. Some species use sonar for navigation while the others use um, depth perspectives and so on. So the idea is that if, I mean, there seems to be almost an unassailable wall between the umwells of different species. Right? There is no common factor or no common scale between how it is for a bat to perceive a tree versus how it is for us to perceive a tree. And the reason that this is because it's an entirely different sensorium with no common property between them. And I mean, if you've been following this talk, you probably know where I'm going next. So my argument is that there is indeed a common dimension between these sensoriums, and that common dimension to bridge these different sensoriums is time. And the thing is, this is not a novel idea. I'm not the first person who's proposing a taxonomy of time to understand perception in non-humans. People have been doing that forever when it comes to things like critical flicker frequency thresholds. So the idea here is that all artificial light actually flickers, whether it's the screen of your phone, your laptop, the headlights on your car, street lights, and so on. So none of them are actually steady, but they keep going on and off. They just go on and off at a rate that's imperceptible to us. Right. So people have tried to map or like try to investigate what is this critical flicker frequency threshold in different species. And if you lay it out, there's a huge variability between different species, going from something like 4 hertz in shrimp to 60 hertz in humans to 500 hertz in houseflies. Right, so this is just simple retinal response to steady versus flickering light. And it seems that different species are sensitive to different rates of flicker. And people have used these sort of arguments to map what it would be like for, let's say, a flycatcher to trace the fly path of an insect. So in A, you have the fly path of an insect captured at the frame rate of human vision. And on B, you have the same fly path captured at the frame rate of a flycatcher's visual frame rate. And people in the past have argued that maybe flycatchers or birds that have a higher critical flicker frequency threshold see the world in slow motion. They've also looked at the different kinds of relationships between conspecifics and different species. So let's say in panel A, you have the actual movement of a squirrel. And because squirrels have a very high frame rate in their vision, if you will. If a squirrel was seeing another squirrel moving, it would see that motion, let's say at a first order integral, versus if an owl that was trying to hunt the squirrel would see it at a much coarser time grain of movements, right? Because owls have a much poorer visual temporal resolution than squirrels. And people have tried to study how something that perceives the world at a poorer temporal resolution can hunt something that perceives the world at a greater temporal resolution. And what people have done is they have proposed windows of integration based on an animal's um, um, sensitivity in time. So let's say, again, you have an actual moment trajectory on top, and then you look at what different species would be able to extract from those movement patterns, and how long would their windows of integration have to be for them to get an estimate of this movement. And again, people have tried to show that fast moving organisms like flies or flycatchers have a more fine grained estimate of movements than slow moving animals like turtles and so on. But the problem here is that all of this is done at a single time scale, which is just like retinal sensitivity to light, right? And we already know that that's not true to, I mean, that's not enough to capture aspects of our experience in humans. So like, let's say if, like, let's look at this display here, right? So this sort of a mock-up of a billboard already has lot of temporal regularities. We are perceiving apparent motion as these lights move across the screen. There's also a regularity of paying attention to each of those numbers and letters as they move across so that you can remember them as they're moving. And there's obviously the critical flicker frequency part, which is where you can, like, even though these LED lights are flickering, you see them as steady. So like with the kind of taxonomy that people have been doing for non-humans, the only thing that they can predict when you show a display like this is whether an animal sees one point in this display as flickering or steady. You can't use that to predict whether animals would see motion. You can't predict whether this duration is enough for them to extract meaning out of it. You can't predict how long they can retain this information for, and so on. So what I will do now is try to present some demonstrations of how understanding this temporal organization over multiple time scales might allow us a window into sensoriums of different species. And I'll be using examples from visual illusions, attention, and pain. So let's say I'll use this framework to look at first at the mating ritual of a peacock. Okay, so I hope this video can. Oh God, please. Okay, let me just do the thing of stopping the share and sharing it again, because this is really cool and I want to show it to you. This work. Can you still see my screen? Let me try playing it maybe in. Oh God.
We can see your screen, but we see your slides as
Yeah, I
well.
know.
So it's
I know.
not
I know.
okay.
It's just I'm trying to see if I can play it without full screen. Sorry, it doesn't seem to work. Let me try again. I don't know why this is giving me trouble only today. Okay. I don't think it's
We're
going
also
to
just
work.
approaching the hour mark.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, okay, I'll just go quickly through it if I can, but yeah, I'm sorry, I can't interact with my screen anymore after I share it. Let me just try it one last time. And if it doesn't work, I'll just skip it and leave it for
Sounds good.
the discussion.
Also, some people asked for the YouTube link. Maybe after the talk, you can.
Yeah. Let me just try this one last time. And then if it doesn't work, I'll just very quickly go over it.
Sounds good.
Okay, that's not going to work. So what I was going to do was I was going to use this illusion to show you what a peahen might see when a peacock dances in front of it. So here what you have is that you can create an illusion of depth by flickering stimuli at different rates in an ambiguous display. So on the left, you have dots flickering really fast, and on the right, you have dots flickering really slowly. And what this does is it creates a disparity. And it sort of seems like the right-hand side of the display is in front of this region on the left. And the idea was that when a peacock dances, it has this, yeah, maybe, sorry, this is just really bad technical situation. So, okay, I have like 3 minutes, so I'll just see what
I mean, we do technically have until 12:30, but it would be nice to leave enough time for discussion because I think lots of people are interested to ask questions.
So Ishan, if you send me the videos afterwards, I can link them on the website so that people can have access to them.
Right. No, sure.
Great.
Anyways, I don't think it's going to work. I'll just skip it.
Yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
good. Do you have?
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, we can do the animal things as a discussion at the end if people have questions, but yeah, I'll just stop it for
Okay.
now.
So maybe we can stop here. That's all right. Thank you
Yeah.
so much,
thanks.
Ishan. So everybody, please unmute and give Ishan a round of applause for a very interesting talk. Steve, maybe you can stop the recording so we can